Li Qi saying goodbye to Wei Wan, returning to the capital. At dawn, the traveler sings his farewell song. Overnight, the first light frost had crossed the river. Painful, the sound of wild geese overhead. The view of cloud-topped mountains in the traveler's path. By closed city gates, trees will soon change color from the cold. In the Imperial Park at dusk, you'll hear the din of washboards. I can't say I'm mad about the pleasures of the capital. It's where too many wasted years slipped by. So here we have a poem by Li Qi, whom we've already encountered. This is his 7th poem in the anthology. Having 7 poems this is his 7th and last, as I said, having 7 poems would probably locate him in the mid-range of the poets in this collection. I mean, the vast majority of poets here have 1 or 2 poems, maybe less than 20%, I would have to calculate, have more than that. And out of those 20%, the vast majority have, let's say, between 5 and 10 poems. So Li Qi should be considered, perhaps, at least in the consideration of the critic who collected these poems, a silver author. Now, I was a bit surprised by this presence of Li Qi in this anthology because, before reading this collection, I had no idea. I didn't have him in my mind. And, I'm not an expert in Tang poetry, but before reading this, I could probably have mentioned the names of, let's say, 15 Tang poets. Li Qi wouldn't have been among them, but it seems he was relatively important, not only from what I see in this anthology, but from a couple of other things I've read. If you remember, all of his poems in this anthology, including this one, are heptasyllabic. Most of them are old-style poems, I think 5 out of the 7. Then there is one ballad, one Jue Fu in the old style, which is heptasyllabic, and now we have this poem as well. His poems in this collection, a lot of them were about music, about musical instruments, but most of them were about foreign musical instruments. The frontier is a topic that he wrote about in those poems as well. And he had a reputation for the free style, for being unconventional, not too Confucian. So his poems are not generally about the courtly world or service. They're more about other things. This poem that we have today, though, is a rather conventional one. So it falls in the typical area that we've encountered of parting poems. One scholar official is going away, and in these circumstances, this was one of the social circumstances in which scholar officials got together, drank wine, recited poetry, and it was a sad, melancholy event amidst the pleasures and the beauty because of the separation that was about to take place. So this falls in line with the typical separation poems with its sad tone, and slightly unusual event, but not weird or unexpected or completely unexpected. The separation is because Wei Wan, the person to whom this poem is directed, is leaving for the capital. We might imagine that he might have spent some time with Li Qi in some provincial post. But now Wei Wan is going back to the capital. So there was probably, as I said, a goodbye party, and probably in that party this poem was composed impromptu by Li Qi to honor his friend and to send him away. So the topic is parting and the sadness associated with parting. And we do have a very light indirect element of eremitism, or at least of rejection of the world of court and power in the last couplet, as we shall see. Okay, let's, as usual, take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. At dawn, the traveler sings his farewell song. Overnight, the first light frost had crossed the river. So the poem locates us from the beginning, as usually it is done by the first couplet of the poem, in the contextual background. So we are at the moment where the traveler where this Wei Wan is about to leave. It's morning, it's dawn, and it seems that, Wei Wan is reciting one last poem, singing one last farewell song to his friends who might be with him, we might imagine, just outside the city gates of the city where they were residing, on the road towards the imperial capital, towards Chang'an. So the traveler sings his farewell song at dawn in the morning. And the night before, the first light frost had crossed the river. So frost is arriving. We might imagine that we must be in autumn from this reference to a first frost. Yeah, we're in autumn. And perhaps not in the beginning of autumn either. And remember, this seasonal setting collaborates to emphasize the pathos, the sadness of the poem, as autumn is the season of sadness, season of decline and melancholy and rising cold. So there's a curious parting and coming, which is contrasted in the first and second line. Wei Wan is going to travel towards the capital. Frost is coming, is traveling our way. Autumn is coming in our direction as well. So the human leaving, the season of cold coming. Okay, second couplet. Painful, the sound of wild geese overhead, the view of cloud-topped mountains in the traveler's path. So painful is the adjective that, starts the second couplet, that marks the tone. Pain is felt. Why is pain felt? Well, evidently we're in a poem of parting, so the imminent separation is supposed to make all participants sad. But here we get some nature images that intensify the sadness. So first is an oral image. We hear geese flying overhead. This again emphasizes, this hammers in the point that we're in autumn. Yeah, migrating birds are moving around. And remember, geese are used to an abusive and almost conventional and hackneyed way to denote parting and the sadness at parting, the desire for communicating with people who are far away, and the geese is sometimes an alter ego for the poet who feels lonely, alone, and traveling in distant lands. So the geese reminds, if it needed reminding, that the parting is about to take place, the sound of those geese flying. The second image is of cloud-topped mountains in the traveler's path. This image, I think both images center on not on the poetic persona, not on Li Qi, but on his parting friend. So his parting friend is like a goose who's going to start a solitary flight towards the capital. And the second image, really puts the emphasis on the difficulties of traveling. On the road is hard, which is also a very conventional image or idea in almost all poems about traveling. Those mountains covered by clouds are meant to denote the difficulty, the roughness of the road to the capital, a road that will take the person who follows it probably some weeks or months, depending on the part of the empire they start from. So a difficult road overhead and a lonely road is presaged for Wei Wan. Third couplet. Now the third couplet moves us forward, if you wish, because it's an imagining of what will happen in the future. And it's a parallelistic couplet, like probably the second one. The parallelism is very visible in the third couplet, and it emphasizes not only the future passage of the seasons, the future entering into autumn in two different spaces, which probably denote in both urban human spaces. So the first one, the city gates, probably denotes Li Qi's space, the space where he will be in a few weeks or months' time, and the imperial park denotes the place, the space where Wei Wan will be in a few months or weeks' time. By closed city gates, trees will soon change color from the cold. In the imperial park at dusk, you'll hear the din of the washboards. So you can see the parallelism very clearly. Yeah, city gates, imperial park, trees, washboards. Yeah. Probably the Chinese couplet doesn't contain any explicit indication of future meaning, so this but it's probably implied because the second line denotes or locates Wei Wan in the Imperial Park, and he is just starting the trip now, so it's probably quite a correct way of reading this couplet, imagining that the two images are projected into the future. So close city gates. Cities, this was a time of danger and banditry, even in the peaceful Tang Empire. It was wise to close city gates at nightfall to avoid robbers and attacks. So by the closed city gates at night, and we can imagine Li Qi projecting himself into a vision of him looking out at the closed city gates from within the city. By those gates, the trees will soon change color from the cold. So its autumn is circulating more and more. The leaves that are green will turn red. That's again one of the beautiful but also the melancholy sides of autumn. Meanwhile, far away, Wei Wan will be in the capital. And what will happen there? In the Imperial Park at dusk, you will hear the din of washboards. So we might imagine, or Li Qi is imagining Wei Wan coming back from service, perhaps in the Imperial City, crossing the Imperial Park at night, so just after he has been sent home from a whole day's service, and an oral image is presented. He will hear the din of washboards. Now, the din of washboards, it has appeared already in previous poems as one of the images of the city at night, of a capital city, a big city at night. So women would have washed the clothes and would have folded them with big mallets or hammers to dry them and to clean them. So this sort of dull thumping, thump, 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 all through the night, it generally appears in a lot of poems as a melancholy, sad sound. It evokes autumn because there's the changing of the clothes, which happens 2 times a year, because you have summer clothes and winter clothes, and in autumn, I imagine you prepare and you wash your set of winter clothes, as in spring you would prepare the set of summer clothes. So that sad thumping is the sound of autumn in an urban landscape. And while Li Qi is looking sadly at the tinted leaves, Wei Wan will be hearing sadly the dull thumping sound of the mallets thumping clothes in the capital. Finally, the last couplet, as is usual in these cases, the last couplet generally opens up the mind space of the poetic persona and of the poet. It tells us his subjective feelings and appreciation in a more direct way than through the poem. In the poem, generally, you have images, natural images or physical, urban images that act as representatives, as symbols, as catalysts, as visualizations, concretizations of the feelings of the poet, which in this case were, feelings of sadness at the arrival of autumn. But here, the poetic persona does make a very explicit expression of what he thinks, and also of what he thinks about life in the capital, with quite a critical tone. We read, "I can't say I'm mad about the pleasures of the capital. It's where too many wasted years slipped by." So we could imagine perhaps that Li Qi might experience envy at the fact that his friend is leaving for the capital, probably for serving in office, maybe close to the emperor with a possibility of promotion and success. But the last line seems clearly to point to Li Qi's indifference or even rejection of the life of ambition and power at the court, or the frivolities of the new Babylon, of the great capital, where all pleasures and luxuries may be attained. He says, "I'm not mad about the pleasures of the capital that you are probably going to walk towards and experience, my friend." He says, "I wasted too many years there." So we might imagine this might evoke the youth, the profligate youth of Li Qi in the capital when he was a young student, preparing for the examinations probably. He is a High Tang poet, so he would have enjoyed in his youth Chang'an at its best and brightest, a city of 1 million inhabitants, the biggest in the earth at that moment, with massive markets, bustling street life, all sorts of pleasures that could be found, books, female company, exotic foods, everything that could be enjoyed, luxurious metals, perfumes, jewels from foreign countries. And, a lot of the scholar officials and the candidates to office enjoyed the pleasure quarters of the capital, which had an enormous reputation with geisha-like women who entertained the scholar officials with poetry and music, besides other more frivolous and material pleasures. In fact, the pleasure quarters in the capital were quite close to the university and to the area where the candidates for office used to dwell. But all this world of frivolity, of superficiality, now does not affect Li. He doesn't miss it. And in saying goodbye to his friend, he is, in a way, pointing to an alternative way of life, which does not include missing or sighing for the world of the capital. So this would be a topic that would take us somewhere else. Appreciations of the importance of serving at court change during the Tang dynasty. So during the first centuries of the dynasty, after it was founded, the state was very powerful. The court attracted all the literary writers and figures it could. The examination system, which basically privileged literary ability, was also officialized. And the poetry, at least the one that has been preserved from, let's say, from the 7th century especially, is, very court-focused. And we've encountered some poets that wrote this sort of aesthetically very refined and dark court poetry for praising generally frivolous subject matters like imperial parties, celebrations, banquets. And, it was a court-centered poetry, and most important poets wrote for the court. People like Shen Chuanqi, I think, that we've encountered, and a few other poets. In the 8th century, poetry was still very important, especially before the Alushan Rebellion. The court was still a main center for poetry, but there is a slight but inevitable push of poetry and poets away from the world of the court. Chinese society, by the time of Xuanzang and Emperor Xuanzang in the first half of the 8th century, has had at least about a century and a half of peace and prosperity. Literacy has expanded massively. A lot of people now can read and take the examinations. Too many people, maybe, because there are not enough vacancies for all of them. You've got a lot of people who can't join office, and some of them, adopt the other role that a Confucian scholar official can when he cannot be in office, the role of the retired person who renounces the vile dust and pretensions of the world. And, this poem fits in that second line. The ending, very specifically, seems to follow that line of serving the court is not an end in itself. There are better things a scholar official can do. And this will only progress more and more through the later periods after the court becomes weaker, after the Alushan Rebellion. So you will get more poets that follow this line of not making courtly poetry or being obsessed with serving at court, but just with self-cultivation through poetry, among other things.